Hi everyone, my name is Stephanie Amico and I am an MPH dietetics student at UMass Lowell. For my cultural recipe makeover, I'll be making a healthier version of ramen. Before we jump into the recipe, let's talk about ramen. Ramen first became popular in the early 1900s in China, being made with wheat-based noodles, and soon after became popular in Japan as well. A traditional Japanese-style ramen uses a mixture of a kelp broth with either a pork bone or chicken bone broth. It was created as a quick and low-cost meal for the working class, but over time, as recipes developed and improved, it now can be seen as a gourmet dish depending on how it's prepared. For traditional ramens, there's so many different kinds. You got your tonkatsu, miso, shoyu, and shio. The differences between these types really just comes down to what the broth is made out of. For tonkatsu ramen, it's a rich broth that's typically made from pork bones. Miso ramen is made from miso paste, which is fermented soybean paste. Shoyu ramen is a salty and tangy broth that's made from soy sauce, and shio ramen is made from chicken bones and seafood. When it comes to ramen toppings, there's so many different options, which is great because everyone will be able to customize their own ramen to their liking to meet their own personal nutritional goals. Although ramen is very tasty, it isn't always the healthiest. The main reason for this is due to high amounts of both salt, otherwise known as sodium, and saturated fat. Salt can be found in many foods, especially highly processed foods. It's recommended that individuals should try to limit their intake to 2,300 milligrams or less per day. For saturated fat, high amounts can be found in foods such as dairy products, fatty meats, and many cooking oils, although some have a lot more than others. It's recommended that saturated fat should be limited to 13 grams or less per day. The reason behind limiting salt and saturated fat is that consuming high amounts of these on a regular basis can put you at risk for high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, and other chronic diseases and conditions. So today, we're going to be making a modified version of a tonkatsu ramen recipe that has less salt and saturated fat. So feel free to pause if you want to look at the recipe in depth, but on the left side we have the ingredients for the original tonkatsu ramen, and on the right side is the modified version. Everything that's highlighted in purple are my healthy swaps, and everything highlighted in blue is what I added or changed based on what I personally like or had available to me. So here's some pictures of the ingredients. We have unsweetened soy milk, canola oil, low sodium vegetable broth, and some cooking spray. Here are the mushrooms, green onions, tofu, pea sprouts, nori, and ramen noodles. And lastly, I have the canola oil portioned out, as well as some minced garlic and low-sodium soy sauce. So before I jump into the recipe, let's compare the original version to the modified version. I used Chronometer to determine the amount of calories, sodium, and saturated fat in both versions of the recipe. As you can see, there's 2,100 less milligrams of salt and 7 grams less of saturated fat in the modified recipe. So now jumping into the recipe, I'm going to start chopping up the ingredients. Here, I'm chopping up the green onion first. Now I'm cutting up the tofu. I personally like making these into small strips for ramen, but you can cut it up however you'd like. And the mushrooms were a little bit big, so I just cut them a little bit smaller. In a pan, I'm going to heat up a little bit of water for the mushrooms, garlic, and tofu. In a pot, I'm going to put a couple cups of water to boil the pea sprouts and the noodles. And while those are heating up, we can get started on the main broth for the ramen. So here, I'm just putting in the low-sodium vegetable stock, a cup of water, the unsweetened soy milk, and the soy sauce. Be sure to stir the broth every few minutes. And now in the pan, I'm going to get started on cooking up the mushrooms in the water. Once most of the water has cooked off, you can add in the garlic to the mushrooms with some cooking spray. And from here, it should take about 6 to 8 minutes to finish cooking up. So after the mushrooms are done, I'm going to put the tofu in the pan. This should take about 4 to 6 minutes, and remember to cook each side. So now I'm going to blanch the pea sprouts, which means we're going to put them in boiling water for 1 minute. After we take out the pea sprouts, we can cook the noodles, which will take about 3 to 4 minutes to cook. Once those are done, we're just going to take them off the heat so that they can stay moist in the water. And I had a little bit of foam buildup, so I removed that from the broth. And now here's the fun part, putting it all together. So first, I'm going to add the broth into the bowl. And now I'm going to add the noodles into the bowl. And now I'm going to add in all the fun toppings, which include the tofu that we just cooked up, the pea sprouts that were blanched, the mushrooms, and when I went to go put the nori in, they were a little bit big, so I had to break those in half. And last but not least come the green onions. And now, time for the final reveal. After all that cooking, we are rewarded with a healthy version of ramen that isn't super high in sodium or saturated fat. And let me tell you guys, this was super tasty. Thank you for watching, and here are all of my references.